What is up, Iwu crew? Back in the 1970s, hitchhiking was a normalized way of getting transportation. People would ask strangers for a ride without ever thinking twice. And for the most part, all that would happen is that they'd arrive at their destination. However, this was not always the case. Sometimes, a dark and sinister plan hid behind the friendly smiles and seemingly genuine promises. For 15-year-old Mary Vincent, all she had hoped for was a ride to her grandfather's house. What happened instead would change her life forever. Let's get into it. Raised in Las Vegas, by the time Mary Vincent was 15, she had gone through many troubling experiences for being so young. According to various news sources, Mary didn't get along with her parents, often skipped school, and eventually left her home in Las Vegas to go and live with her boyfriend in Sausalito, California. Although that didn't last long. Soon after she went to stay with him, he was allegedly apprehended on assault charges. Not knowing where else to turn, Mary headed back home to Las Vegas before running away once more in 1978. For a short period of time, Mary slept in unlocked cars before eventually deciding to hitchhike her way to Corona, California to get to her grandfather. She also had the hope that once there, she could eventually take up a career as a dancer, as she was quite passionate about it. On September 29, 1978, the determined young teenager made her way to a highway in Berkeley, California. And most drivers paid no mind to the people standing on the side of the road looking for a ride. Mary was among these people, holding a sign that read, "Heading South." Time went on until finally a van pulled up beside her. Inside the van was a middle-aged man, and he kindly asked where she was looking to go. Mary informed him that she was hoping for a ride to Los Angeles, and the man offered to take her there. Allegedly, a few of the women also waiting to hitchhike glanced nervously at the man, and reportedly even warned Mary not to go with him. Desperate to get to her destination, and feeling as though she could trust this stranger, Mary hopped in, despite the other women's alleged concerns. This man reminded Mary of her grandfather, and seemed welcoming and friendly enough. The two soon set off towards Los Angeles. The man's name was Lawrence Singleton, a 50-year-old former merchant seaman. The ride was pleasant enough. That is, until something happened that seemed a bit strange to Mary. As they went, Mary sneezed, and Lawrence reached over to touch her neck before asking if she was ill. Unnerved by the sudden physical contact, she quickly moved away so that he would stop touching her. Although this situation was rather awkward and uncomfortable for the 15-year-old, when nothing else occurred to increase her unease, she began to relax. A little while after, Mary started drifting off. Lawrence had made no further advancements, and she felt as though it was safe once more. She figured that it was a long way to Los Angeles anyways, so why not take a nap? Eventually, down the road, Mary woke from her comfortable slumber to find that Lawrence had gone a different route, one that certainly wouldn't lead to her requested destination. Angered and frightened by this, Mary reportedly threatened Lawrence with a sharp stick she found in the car and demanded that he go the correct direction. Some sources say that Lawrence reassured her that they were going the right way, while others state that he acted as though it was simply a mistake and turned around. Either way, Mary accepted his words, believing he was telling the truth, and they eventually made it to a rest stop. However, Mary was beginning to feel more and more that the man's intentions were not only to get her a ride to Southern California, and unease began to creep into her bones. As Lawrence got out to take a bathroom break, Mary noticed her shoes were untied. Still unsure of how genuine this man really was, she got out to tie her shoes just in case she needed to make a quick escape. As Mary bent over to tie her laces, she had no idea that a shadow was lurking behind her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Suddenly, a sledgehammer slammed into the side of her head, and Mary fell to the ground, completely defenseless. She was then knocked unconscious. When Mary finally awoke, it was a completely different scenario than when she had woken from a contented nap only hours earlier. In utter shock and horror, she realized that her attacker was indeed Lawrence Singleton, the man she had trusted. After knocking her unconscious, Lawrence had pulled her into the van and drove further down a nearby canyon. He then tied her up, securing her arms to the van walls so that she couldn't escape no matter how much she tried. The night that Mary then suffered through was both cruel and sick. Throughout the entire night, she was repeatedly assaulted by Lawrence. The morning after, she pleaded with him to be freed. Coldly, Lawrence taunted her, saying, "If you want to be set free, I'll set you free." Lawrence brought her to the road and laid her down before pulling out a hatchet from his van. Mary watched in fear and confusion as he approached her. He then lifted the hatchet and began to hack away at her arms. Writhing in pain and agony, Mary could do nothing but sit and let her arms get mutilated until both of her forearms had been severed off of her body. Suffering such pain while still conscious is something nobody should have to experience. And yet, even after the pure torture he had just put the young girl through, Lawrence was still not done with his inhumane crime. Mary was then tossed over a 30-foot cliff near Del Puerto Canyon and stuffed into a concrete pipe. Once finished, Lawrence sickeningly remarked, "Okay, now you're free." He left Mary to bleed out inside of the pipe. And as he went on his way, he believed that he had just committed the perfect crime. And yet, even as Mary bled out and suffered excruciating pain, she was not ready to give up. One thought remained with her: how terrible it would be if she let this man commit the same crime against other teenage girls. Miraculously, Mary managed to cover what was left of her arms in mud and mustered the strength to try and find help. She dragged herself back up the cliff and then proceeded to walk an entire 3 miles to the nearest highway, all the while holding her arms up to keep the bleeding to a minimum, as well as prevent her muscles from falling out. Allegedly, the first sign of help she found was a car. However, when the occupants of the vehicle caught sight of her, they sped off in fear, and Mary was left hopelessly by herself. 2 individuals found Mary soon after and immediately rushed her to the hospital. Even after her harrowing captivity, she managed to make it out of the brutal situation alive. Mary was determined not to let Lawrence get away with the horror that he had committed against her, and she later gave a detailed description of the man who had attempted to kill her, one that would help the police find and arrest him. By the time Lawrence was arrested, Mary had been given prosthetic arms, and parts of her leg were used to help salvage what was left of her right arm. Because of this crucial operation, Mary was no longer able to dance, and has since been forced to forget her dreams of ever becoming a dancer. Although Mary had gone through so much already, there still was more that had to be done to ensure Lawrence would be brought to justice. When a trial began 6 months after the crime had been committed, she was ready to testify against him, even though the idea of facing her attacker must have been thoroughly horrifying. Lawrence ended up receiving a mere 14 years in prison for his disturbing acts. Even worse, Lawrence could eventually be eligible for parole. While in court, he had whispered a disturbing threat to Mary: "I'll finish this job, even if it takes the rest of my life." Mary, who was still only a teenager, paled and left the courtroom, and only later did she reveal what he had whispered. Mary received little compensation after everything that she had endured, even though it was extremely difficult to find a job due to her life-altering injuries. Although she was supposed to receive $2.56 million from Lawrence after winning a civil judgment, she ended up with nothing since he had no money to his name. Lawrence was whisked off to jail, and Mary was left permanently damaged by the horrific acts he had inflicted upon her. She went into hiding for a time, terrified that Lawrence could somehow reappear and continue the nightmare she had managed to escape. Various news sources alleged that she developed anorexia, reportedly dropping below 100 pounds for a time. Later on in life, Mary found comfort in a man whom she fell in love with, and the two married. However, they eventually divorced. Meanwhile, in jail, Lawrence was telling his own bizarre version of the story. He reportedly insisted that Mary had threatened him with the sharp stick from his vehicle and acted as if she was going to accuse him of assault. Lawrence even attempted to sue Mary, but the suit was unsurprisingly dismissed by the courts. Shockingly, after only 8 years in prison, Lawrence was paroled for his good behavior, and because he had worked as a teaching assistant in the prison classroom. However, it was extremely difficult to find a place for him to stay during his parole, as many residents in different towns protested strongly to keep him away from their families. In one particular case, Lawrence was transported from a hotel room under armed guard in Rodeo, California, when a whopping 500 people had swarmed the area in protest. After attempting to place him in numerous different towns, he was eventually placed in San Quentin, where he lived in a trailer at the state prison. Lawrence was paroled for about a year before he was released and became a free man once again, and chose to move back to his home state of Florida. Knowing that Lawrence had been released must have only heightened Mary's fear and anxiety. It appeared to be devastating to both Mary and the public that he had been set free so early and might have the chance to follow through with his disturbing threat. After Lawrence had settled in Florida, a neighbor made an intriguing comment on his behavior. Tom Bennett stated that they were afraid of him at first, and then continued, quote, "But every day he'd talk to you. He'd cook steaks and bring them to you. He fixed up his property really good. He was the neighbor you dreamed of. I started to believe him. Maybe he was framed." Another neighbor, who reportedly knew nothing about his disturbing past, let her 2-year-old daughter play in the yard with Lawrence's Rottweiler puppy, Kala, while she and her husband would talk to Lawrence. However, it soon became clear that Lawrence's mental state was still a very dark place, even after beginning a new life in Florida. Neighbors started to feel as if something was wrong when they witnessed Lawrence repeatedly getting in and out of his vehicle. When they went to check up on him, they found him unconscious. They promptly called 911, and it was soon revealed that he had been funneling carbon monoxide into his van. A note was later found, and starts out by saying, "I hope that I find peace." Before continuing, "I would like to thank everyone who helped me. Please have me cremated and have my ashes thrown into Palm River on the outgoing tide." Surviving the attempt to take his own life, Lawrence was then taken to a psychiatric care center and soon released. Despite Lawrence's issues, including 2 petty crimes of theft, he seemed to live a mostly normal life. However, this new life of his didn't last long, and another horrifying crime soon occurred. In 1997, a 31-year-old woman by the name of Roxanne Hayes met Lawrence at his home. Roxanne was a prostitute and worked to support her 3 young children, all of whom she loved deeply. A house painter who had shown up to Lawrence's residence unexpectedly just after Roxanne stumbled upon something unforgettable. As he looked in the window, he realized he was witnessing Lawrence beating and strangling a screaming young woman. Instead of helping her, the painter drove away and called 911. When the police arrived at his house, Lawrence, who had blood all over his body, tried to tell the police that he had cut himself while chopping vegetables. This bizarre excuse wasn't believed for a second, as authorities had already spotted Roxanne's dead body on his floor. Roxanne had been stabbed brutally numerous times, and it was reported that her fingers had nearly been severed off in the struggle. News sources reported that Lawrence had a rather strange explanation for Roxanne's death. He said that Roxanne had actually been stabbed as they struggled to take control of a knife after she threatened to cut his head off. Lawrence also admitted to being depressed and intoxicated at the time of Roxanne's death, and claimed that it had all been an accident. To make things even stranger, Lawrence allegedly claimed that as she was bleeding out, she requested that he hold her, and the two embraced. After she had died, he cried and tried to talk to her to no avail. Upon hearing the news of Roxanne's death, Mary Vincent did not hesitate to testify once more against her attacker. Mary was asked to identify him and was later quoted as saying, "I wanted to see his eyes. Eyes are important. When he was on top of me, I was looking at the axe, trying to stay alive. I asked later if I could look him in the eye, but it didn't happen." With her help, Lawrence Singleton ended up on Florida's death row. Despite his numerous strange explanations and excuses, Lawrence was later quoted as saying, "I was framed the first time, but this time I did it." Roxanne's children, who were all very young at the time, remember their mother fondly. Her 4-year-old son recalled a fun game the two used to play together, and the other children made similarly emotional statements about their mother. In 2001, years after committing his first devastating crime, Lawrence Singleton died of cancer at the age of 74, before an execution could occur. Mary Vincent was finally able to live free of the fear that her previous captor would try and complete his terrifying promise to her. Mary has since learned to live and cope with not only her traumatic memories, but also her prosthetic arms. She has taught herself to cook and draw with her prosthetics, and even become an artist. She started raising a family and makes sure that her 2 sons are careful and wary towards strangers. Mary's ability to survive and adapt to her difficult situation is truly inspiring.